The boy's hands trembled as he pointed to the hidden compartment behind the library shelf, a space no living soul should have known existed. The ledger, 7-year-old Elijah Carter whispered, his voice carrying an authority that didn't belong to a child born enslaved. The real one. Not the books they show the taxmen, the one with the names of the children he sold south. His mother's face went white. The White family, standing in their former plantation's ruins, went silent. Because Elijah Carter, born in 1849 to an enslaved woman on a North Carolina tobacco farm, had just described in perfect detail the secret record-keeping system of Jonathan Whitmore, the plantation's previous owner, dead 3 years before Elijah was born. Before we go further into what became one of the most documented and unexplainable cases in American history, I need you to do something. Subscribe to this channel right now, comment the word memory below, and tell me where you're watching from. Because what you're about to hear challenges everything we think we know about consciousness, identity, and the possibility of justice reaching across the barrier of death itself. This story was buried for over a century, and it needs to be remembered. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Now, let me take you back to how this impossible thing began. The boy who knew too much, Elijah Carter, entered the world on March 14, 1849, in a slave cabin on the Whitmore Plantation in Granville County, North Carolina. His mother, Sarah Carter, was 23 years old, purchased 6 years earlier from a Virginia estate sale for $800. The plantation's records, kept with meticulous precision, listed her as prime field hand, strong constitution, suitable for breeding. The man who owned her, Jonathan Whitmore, ran a mid-sized tobacco operation, 240 acres, 37 enslaved people, annual revenue averaging $4,200. Whitmore himself was 46 years old when Elijah was born, a widower with no children, known throughout the county for his cold efficiency and his obsessive documentation. Every transaction, every punishment, every sale was recorded in multiple ledgers with cross-references and annotations. Jonathan Whitmore died on November 7, 1846, 2 years and 4 months before Elijah Carter was born. The impossibility of what happened next cannot be overstated. Elijah began speaking at 14 months, earlier than most children, but the words that came from his mouth were wrong. Not the simple vocabulary of toddlerhood, but complete sentences with adult syntax. "The lower field needs rotation," he said to his mother one morning, pointing toward the southern tobacco rows. 3 seasons of continuous planting depletes the nitrogen. Father taught me that. Sarah Carter had no father to teach her son anything. Elijah's biological father was unknown, possibly another enslaved man, possibly an overseer, possibly Whitmore himself before his death, though the timing made that unlikely. But Elijah didn't mean that father. He meant a father from before. By age 3, Elijah was drawing maps. Crude maps at first, scratched in the dirt with sticks, but maps nonetheless. Maps of the plantation's layout with remarkable accuracy. Maps showing the locations of the slave quarters, the main house, the tobacco barns, the hidden root cellar where Whitmore stored his valuable documents. Maps that included buildings torn down before Elijah was born. The overseer, a man named Thomas Beckworth, noticed. Beckworth had worked the plantation since 1843, 3 years before Whitmore's death. He'd stayed on when Whitmore's cousin, Robert Whitmore, inherited the property, and he began to watch the strange child with growing unease. At age 4, Elijah told his mother about the night the barn burned. He described it in detail. The smell of the smoke, the sound of the horses screaming, the way the flames lit up the November sky. He described how he had stood on the main house porch, calculating the loss. $4,000 in stored tobacco 2 horses valued at $300 each, 1 barn structure worth $600 in lumber and labor. The barn fire had occurred on November 2nd, 1844, 5 years before Elijah was born. Sarah Carter tried to quiet her son. She tried to teach him to hide what he knew. Because a black child who knew impossible things was a dangerous thing in 1853 North Carolina. But Elijah couldn't stop. The memories, if that's what they were, came unbidden, triggered by places and objects and conversations. When he was 5, Elijah walked past the plantation's main house and stopped dead. The house had been modified since Whitmore's death. A new wing added, the front entrance relocated. The library moved from the 2nd floor to the 1st. Elijah stared at it with an expression of profound disturbance. "It's wrong," he said. "The proportions are wrong. The entrance should face east to catch the morning light. The library belongs upstairs where the air circulation prevents mold on the books. Why would anyone ruin it like this?" He spoke with the indignation of ownership, the indignation of a man who had designed something being forced to witness its desecration. Thomas Beckworth reported these incidents to Robert Whitmore. Robert, a practical man focused on profit margins and crop yields, initially dismissed them as coincidence or the overseer's imagination. But Beckworth kept records. He wrote down what the boy said, when he said it, and what it corresponded to in the plantation's documented history. The pattern was undeniable. The test in the spring of 1856, when Elijah was 7 years old, Robert Whitmore decided to conduct an experiment. He'd heard the stories about the boy. He'd read Beckworth's reports, and he'd begun to experience something he would later describe as a creeping horror. The possibility that something impossible was happening under his roof. Whitmore assembled a group of witnesses: Beckworth, 2 neighboring plantation owners who had known Jonathan Whitmore personally, a local minister named Reverend Samuel Hughes, and a lawyer from the county seat named Charles Morrison. He brought them to the plantation on April 3, 1856, and he brought Elijah Carter before them. The boy stood in the main house's front room, a room he had never been permitted to enter before, and looked around with an expression the witnesses later described as pained recognition. "The furniture is different," Elijah said without being asked. The settee was against the north wall, not the south. The portrait of Mother hung above the mantel. The Turkish rug Father bought in Richmond covered the center floor. Robert Whitmore's face tightened. His cousin Jonathan had indeed purchased a Turkish rug in Richmond in 1842. It had been sold after Jonathan's death to pay estate debts. The portrait of Jonathan's mother, dead since 1831, had hung exactly where Elijah described until Robert moved it to his own home. "What else do you remember about this room?" Reverend Hughes asked, his voice careful. Elijah closed his eyes. The smell of pipe tobacco. Father smoked a blend he ordered from a shop in Charleston. The clockmaker's name was Hendricks. The tall clock in the corner came from his shop in 1838. The books! He opened his eyes and walked to the library shelves. The books were organized by subject, then by author within subject. Philosophy here, agricultural science here, legal texts here. He pointed to specific sections. Charles Morrison, the lawyer, had helped inventory Jonathan Whitmore's estate after his death. He pulled a small notebook from his coat and checked his notes. His hands began to shake. "The boy is correct," Morrison said quietly. That was precisely how Jonathan organized his library. Robert Whitmore led the group upstairs. He took them to what had been Jonathan's private study, now a storage room filled with trunks and furniture. Elijah followed, and when he entered the room, he stopped breathing. "This was my room," he whispered. "My desk faced the window so I could watch the fields while I worked. The ledgers were kept in the cabinet behind the desk, the locked cabinet, the one with the false back. Every man in the room went still." "What "False back?" Robert Whitmore asked. Elijah walked to a heavy wooden cabinet pushed against the wall. This one, Father had it specially made in 1840. The cabinet maker's name was Sullivan. He had a shop in Raleigh. The cabinet has a hidden compartment behind the main storage area. You access it by removing the third shelf and pressing the back panel at the upper right corner. Robert Whitmore stared at the cabinet. He'd inherited it with the house. He'd used it for storage for 10 years without knowing it had any special features. "Show me," he said. Elijah removed the items from the third shelf. He pressed the back panel where he'd indicated. There was a click. The back panel swung inward, revealing a space approximately 18 inches deep, running the full width of the cabinet. Inside were ledgers, 4 of them bound in leather, covered in dust. Charles Morrison lifted one out with trembling hands. He opened it to a random page. The handwriting was unmistakably Jonathan Whitmore's. Morrison had seen enough of his documents to recognize it instantly. The page showed a detailed accounting of a slave sale conducted in 1843. Names, ages, prices, buyers, locations. "These are the children he sold south," Elijah said, his voice flat. "The ones he didn't record in the main ledgers. The ones he told the mothers died of fever. 12 children between 1841 and 1845. Sold to a broker in New Orleans named Matthias Cord. Prices ranging from $400 to $700 depending on age and health." Morrison turned pages. The entries matched what Elijah described. 12 children, names, dates, prices, sales that appeared nowhere in the official estate records. One of the neighboring planters, a man named William Ashford, sat down heavily in a chair. "I was there when Jonathan told Mary her son died," he said. 1843. The boy was 6 years old. Jonathan showed her a grave. He held a funeral. Ashford's voice broke. "He sold that child for $600, Elijah said, to a sugar plantation outside New Orleans. The boy's name was Samuel. He was strong for his age. Good price for a 6-year-old. He said it with Jonathan Whitmore's calculating coldness, the economic assessment of a man who had viewed human beings as agricultural assets. The room was silent except for the sound of Morrison turning pages, checking entry after entry, finding them accurate to Elijah's descriptions. "How do you know these things?" Reverend Hughes asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elijah looked at him with eyes that held something ancient and terrible. "Because I wrote them," he said. "I am Jonathan Whitmore. Or I was. I don't understand it either, but I remember. I remember everything." The investigation. What happened next was unprecedented in the American South. Robert Whitmore, shaken to his core by what he'd witnessed, made a decision that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. He allowed a formal investigation into his cousin's hidden crimes, and he allowed Elijah Carter to be questioned extensively about his impossible memories. The investigation was led by Charles Morrison and documented by a court stenographer named Albert Finch. Over the course of 6 weeks in the spring and summer of 1856, Elijah was interviewed for a total of 43 hours. Every session was witnessed by multiple observers. Every claim he made was checked against available records. The accuracy rate was terrifying. Elijah described financial transactions Jonathan Whitmore had conducted in Richmond, Charleston, and New Orleans between 1835 and 1846. When investigators tracked down the relevant business records, bank drafts, bills of sale, shipping manifests, they found Elijah's descriptions accurate in 87% of cases where documentation still existed. He described personal conversations Jonathan had held with other planters, with his lawyer, with his doctor. When those men were located and questioned, they confirmed details they'd never shared with anyone else. Private discussions about investments, about health concerns, about political opinions. He described the layout of buildings in Raleigh and Charleston as they'd existed in the 1840s, before modifications that occurred after Jonathan's death. City records and old photographs confirmed his descriptions. He knew the names of Jonathan's childhood friends, his school teachers, his first horse, his mother's favorite hymn, his father's death date, the location of a scar on his left thigh from a childhood riding accident. But the most disturbing knowledge was about the people Jonathan had enslaved. Elijah knew their names, all 37 of them who'd been on the plantation at the time of Jonathan's death. He knew their ages, their family relationships, their skills, their purchase prices, their medical histories. He knew which ones Jonathan had considered selling, which ones he'd considered breeding, which ones he'd punished, and for what infractions. He knew because Jonathan Whitmore had kept exhaustive records, and those records lived in Elijah's mind with perfect clarity. "There's a woman named Ruth," Elijah said during one interview session. "She's 41 years old now. She was purchased in 1838 from an estate sale in Virginia for $550. She has a scar on her right shoulder from a burn she received as a child. Jonathan considered her a poor investment because she was frequently ill, but he kept her because she was an excellent seamstress." Ruth was brought in. She was indeed 41 years old. She had indeed been purchased in 1838 for $550. The sale record still existed. She had a burn scar on her right shoulder. "How does he know these things?" she asked, her voice shaking. "How does this child know what Master Whitmore knew?" No one could answer her. The investigation uncovered 12 children sold secretly to Matthias Cord in New Orleans. It uncovered financial fraud. Jonathan had underreported his income to tax assessors by an average of 32% annually. It uncovered evidence of 3 murders, enslaved people who had died under suspicious circumstances that Jonathan had attributed to disease but had actually resulted from punishment. One was a man named Jacob who had attempted escape in 1842. Jonathan's official records stated Jacob died of pneumonia. The hidden ledger revealed the truth. Jacob had been whipped, denied medical care, and left to die over the course of 4 days as an example to others. The entry included the notation, "Necessary discipline, regrettable economic loss of $900 asset." Elijah recited this entry from memory, including the dollar amount, and then broke down crying, a 7-year-old child weeping for a murder committed by the man whose memories he carried. Charles Morrison compiled a report of 347 pages documenting the investigation. He sent copies to the governor of North Carolina, to several prominent lawyers, and to a professor of philosophy at the University of Virginia named Dr. Edmund Blackwell, who had published papers on consciousness and memory. The responses ranged from fascination to horror to outright denial. Governor Thomas Bragg acknowledged receipt of the report but took no action. The legal framework of 1856 North Carolina provided no mechanism for prosecuting a dead man's crimes or for addressing the legal status of a child who claimed to be the reincarnation of his former owner. Dr. Blackwell traveled to North Carolina to interview Elijah personally. He spent 2 weeks conducting tests, asking questions, trying to find evidence of fraud or coaching. He found none. His conclusion, published in a private letter that later became public: "I can identify no natural explanation for this child's knowledge. Either we are witnessing an elaborate and undetectable deception involving dozens of conspirators, or we are confronting evidence that consciousness can survive death and transfer between bodies. I find both possibilities equally disturbing." The theological crisis. Reverend Samuel Hughes, the minister who had witnessed the initial test, faced a crisis of faith that would consume the rest of his life. He was a Presbyterian, trained in a theology that held clear positions on the soul, the afterlife, and the impossibility of reincarnation. Elijah Carter's existence challenged all of it. Hughes spent months interviewing Elijah, trying to understand the theological implications. The conversations were recorded in Hughes's personal journals, later donated to the Presbyterian Historical Society. "Do you remember dying?" Hughes asked during one session. "Yes," Elijah said. "It was November 7th, 1846, evening. I was in my study reviewing the harvest accounts. I felt a pain in my chest, sharp like a knife. I tried to stand but couldn't. I fell. I remember Thomas Beckworth finding me. I remember trying to speak but no words coming. I remember the room getting dark, and then what? Nothing. For a long time, nothing. And then awareness, but different, confused. I was in a body, but it was wrong, too small, weak. I couldn't speak. I couldn't make my limbs work properly. It took months to realize I was an infant. It took years to understand what had happened. Do you remember being born, being Elijah? I remember the awareness starting. I don't remember the birth itself. My first clear memory as Elijah is from when I was about 6 months old. I was lying in a cabin and I could hear my mother singing. And I knew the song was wrong. She was singing a slave song, and I was supposed to be somewhere else. I was supposed to be in the big house. I was supposed to be the master. Hughes wrote in his journal, "The child speaks of his current life with a sense of wrongness, of displacement. He knows he is Elijah Carter, son of Sarah, born enslaved. But he feels he is Jonathan Whitmore, displaced into an impossible existence. The psychological torment of this dual consciousness is evident. He is a child who remembers being an adult. He is black but remembers being white. He is enslaved but remembers being the enslaver. What theology can account for this? What God would permit such a thing?" The question haunted Hughes. If reincarnation was possible, what did that mean for Christian doctrine? If a soul could transfer from a white plantation owner to a black enslaved child, what did that mean for the racial hierarchies that justified slavery? If Jonathan Whitmore's consciousness survived in Elijah Carter, was Whitmore being punished? Was this divine justice, forcing a man who had enslaved others to experience enslavement himself? Or was it something else entirely? Hughes consulted other ministers, theologians, philosophers. The responses were divided. Some saw Elijah as evidence of demonic possession. Some saw him as a hoax. Some saw him as a test of faith. A few saw him as something genuinely new, evidence that the universe operated according to principles Christianity had not yet understood. One theologian, a Methodist minister named Jacob Thornton, proposed a theory that Hughes recorded. Perhaps this is God's justice made manifest. Jonathan Whitmore lived a life of cruelty disguised as order. He kept meticulous records of his sins, as if documentation made them righteous. Now he is forced to confront those sins from the other side. He is forced to live as the people he oppressed. He is forced to know their suffering not as an abstract concept, but as lived reality. If this is reincarnation, it is reincarnation as moral education. But Elijah himself rejected this interpretation. "I don't feel like I'm being punished," he told Hughes. "I feel like I'm being shown something. Like there's a reason I need to remember. Like the memories aren't just about Jonathan Whitmore's life. They're about the people he hurt. I remember their names. I remember what he did to them. And now I'm one of them. I'm living what they lived. And I can tell people. I can make sure it's remembered." Hughes wrote, "The child speaks of his condition not as punishment but as testimony. He believes he is meant to bear witness. To what end, I cannot say, but there is a moral clarity in his purpose that troubles me deeply. He is 7 years old, but he speaks with the gravity of a man who has seen the worst of humanity and chosen to remember it rather than forget." The community's response news of Elijah Carter spread through Granville County and beyond. The response was fractured along predictable lines, but with unexpected complications. Many white plantation owners were terrified. If a black child could carry the memories of a white man, what did that mean for the entire structure of racial slavery? The system depended on the belief that black people were fundamentally different, inferior, incapable of the same depth of thought and feeling as whites. Elijah Carter's existence suggested that consciousness was not bound by race, that a soul, if souls existed, could inhabit any body, that the differences used to justify enslavement were superficial rather than essential. Some planters demanded Elijah be sold away or killed. They argued he was dangerous, that his very existence undermined the social order. Robert Whitmore received multiple offers to purchase Elijah, offers ranging from $1,000 to $3,000, far above the normal price for a 7-year-old child. The buyer's intent was clear: remove the problem. But Robert Whitmore refused to sell. He'd been shaken by the investigation's findings. He'd learned that his cousin, a man he'd respected, had committed fraud and murder and child selling, and he'd begun to believe that Elijah's existence was indeed some form of divine justice. If God has chosen to reveal my cousin's sins through this child, Whitmore wrote in a letter to a friend, then I have no right to silence that revelation. Whatever Jonathan did, whatever he was, he is being held accountable in a way I do not understand but cannot deny. Whitmore freed Elijah Carter and his mother Sarah on July 4, 1856. The manumission papers cited extraordinary circumstances and moral obligation. He gave them a small house on the edge of the plantation property and a stipend of $10 per month. Enough to live on, barely, in 1856 North Carolina. The response from the enslaved community was complex. Some saw Elijah as a miracle, as proof that God saw their suffering and would deliver justice, even if it took the form of forcing their oppressors to live as they had lived. Some saw him as a threat, a white man's consciousness in a black body, someone who could never truly be one of them. Some saw him as deeply pitiable, a child cursed with memories of atrocities he'd committed in another life. Sarah Carter's response was perhaps the most complicated of all. She loved her son, but she struggled with the knowledge that her son carried the consciousness of a man who might have owned her, who had certainly owned and brutalized people like her. She struggled with the moments when Elijah spoke with Jonathan's voice, when his face took on expressions that belonged to a middle-aged white man rather than a black child. Sometimes I look at him and I see my baby, she told a friend, according to a letter preserved in a private collection. And sometimes I look at him and I see the master, and I don't know which one is real. I don't know if my son is my son or if he's someone else wearing my son's face. And I don't know if I'm raising a child or if I'm caring for the ghost of the man who might have owned me. The psychological burden on Elijah himself was immense. He was a child with an adult's memories. He was black but remembered being white. He was free but remembered owning slaves. He knew things a child shouldn't know: the mechanics of violence, the economics of human trafficking, the casual cruelty of absolute power. And he remembered the people Jonathan Whitmore had hurt. He remembered their faces, their names, their suffering, and many of them were still alive, still enslaved, still on the plantation where Jonathan had brutalized them. The testimony. In the fall of 1856, Elijah Carter did something unprecedented. He began to testify. With Charles Morrison's help, he provided detailed accounts of Jonathan Whitmore's crimes. He identified the 12 children sold to New Orleans. He described the 3 murders. He revealed the financial fraud. Morrison used this information to locate some of the sold children. It took months of correspondence with contacts in Louisiana, but eventually he found records of 7 of the 12. 3 had died, 1 of yellow fever, 2 of overwork on sugar plantations. 4 were still alive, still enslaved, in their late teens and early 20s. Morrison purchased their freedom using money from Jonathan Whitmore's estate, money Robert Whitmore agreed to allocate for this purpose. The cost was $4,200. The 4 young people were brought back to North Carolina in the spring of 1857. One of them was Samuel, the 6-year-old boy Jonathan had told his mother died of fever. He was now 20 years old, scarred from years of brutal labor, barely able to speak from trauma. Elijah met him in Robert Whitmore's house. Samuel stared at the 8-year-old boy who claimed to remember selling him. "I'm sorry," Elijah said. "I know that doesn't mean anything. I know sorry doesn't fix what was done. But I remember you. I remember your mother Mary. I remember telling her you were dead. I remember watching her grieve. And I remember counting the $600 I got for you and recording it in my ledger. I remember all of it. And I'm sorry." Samuel broke down. He wept for an hour while Elijah sat with him, this child who remembered being his tormentor, and Sarah Carter held them both. "I don't understand this," Samuel said finally. "I don't understand how you can be him and be you. I don't understand what God is doing, but you brought me home. You and Mr. Morrison, you brought me back. So I guess I forgive you. Or him. Or whoever you are." The scene was witnessed by Morrison, by Reverend Hughes, by Robert Whitmore. Hughes wrote in his journal, "I watched a man forgive his enslaver who was now a child, who remembered the sin but was not the same person who committed it. I watched grace extended across an impossible divide. I do not understand the theology of this moment, but I know I witnessed something holy." Elijah continued his testimony. He provided information that led to the prosecution of Matthias Cord, the New Orleans broker who had purchased the children. Cord was never convicted. Louisiana courts in 1857 had no interest in prosecuting slave traders, but his business was damaged by the publicity. Several planters refused to work with him after the story spread. Elijah identified the 3 murdered men: Jacob, who died from whipping in 1842, Thomas, who died from infected wounds after punishment in 1844, and Daniel, who died from deliberate starvation in 1845. Their families were still on the plantation. Elijah met with them, told them the truth about how their loved ones had died, and gave them the locations where Jonathan had buried the bodies in unmarked graves. The families exhumed the remains and gave them proper burials. Elijah attended each funeral. He was 8 years old, standing in a cemetery, mourning men he remembered killing. The later years, Elijah Carter lived until 1924, dying at the age of 75. His life after the initial revelation was marked by a strange duality. He was simultaneously a freedman trying to build a life in post-Civil War America, and a man carrying the memories of a slave owner, trying to atone for crimes he remembered committing but had not, in his current body, actually committed. He never fully integrated into either the black or white communities of North Carolina. He was too strange, too disturbing, too much a reminder of uncomfortable truths. But he found purpose in testimony and education. During the Civil War, Elijah worked with Union forces as a consultant. His knowledge of plantation operations, of how enslavers thought and planned, of the economic structures that sustained slavery, all of it proved valuable. He helped identify Confederate supply lines, predict planter responses to Union advances, and locate hidden assets that planters tried to conceal. After the war, during Reconstruction, Elijah became a teacher. He established a school for freed people in Granville County, using money he'd saved and donations from Northern abolitionists who'd heard his story. He taught reading, writing, mathematics, and history, But he also taught something else. He taught his students about the systems that had enslaved them. You need to understand how they thought, he told his students, according to a memoir written by one of them in 1903. You need to understand the economics, the laws, the justifications they used, because they'll try to rebuild those systems under new names. They'll try to re-enslave you through debt, through laws, through violence. And you need to recognize it when it happens. You need to know the patterns. He was teaching them using Jonathan Whitmore's memories, using the knowledge of how a planter structured exploitation, how he calculated profit from human suffering, how he used law and custom and violence to maintain control. Elijah was turning his curse into a tool for resistance. He married in 1870 to a woman named Grace Thompson, who had been born free in Pennsylvania. She knew his story, everyone knew his story, but she loved him anyway. They had 3 children. Elijah was terrified throughout each pregnancy, afraid that his children might somehow carry Jonathan's memories too, that the curse might be hereditary. But his children were normal. They had no memories of past lives. They were simply themselves. Elijah wrote extensively about his experience. He produced a manuscript of over 800 pages detailing his memories of Jonathan Whitmore's life and his own struggle to understand his dual existence. The manuscript was published in 1889 under the title 2 Lives, 1 Soul, The Testimony of Elijah Carter. It sold poorly. The reading public of 1889 wasn't ready for a book that challenged both racial categories and religious certainty, but it was preserved, and it remains one of the most detailed first-person accounts of the psychological experience of claimed reincarnation ever recorded. In the manuscript, Elijah wrestled with questions of identity and responsibility. Was he Jonathan Whitmore? Was he Elijah Carter? Was he both? Was he neither? If he remembered Jonathan's crimes, was he guilty of them? If he was guilty, how could he atone? If he wasn't guilty, why did he carry the memories? I have lived 2 lives, he wrote. One as a man who enslaved others, who saw human beings as property, who committed acts of cruelty I can barely stand to remember. One as a man who was born into the condition I once inflicted on others, who experienced the suffering I once caused. I do not know if this is punishment or education or something else entirely, but I know this. I remember the names of the people Jonathan Whitmore hurt. I remember their faces. I remember what was done to them. And as long as I live, I will make sure others remember too. That is my purpose. That is my atonement. That is the only meaning I can find in this impossible existence. The evidence and the mystery. The case of Elijah Carter has been investigated by historians, psychologists, and paranormal researchers for over a century. The documentation is extensive. Morrison's 347-page report, Hughes's journals, Elijah's own manuscript, testimony from dozens of witnesses, plantation records, legal documents, letters, and newspaper accounts. The accuracy of Elijah's knowledge has been verified in every case where independent documentation exists. He knew things a child born in 1849 could not possibly have known through normal means. The explanations proposed fall into several categories. Theory 1. Elaborate fraud. This theory suggests Elijah was coached by adults who had access to Jonathan Whitmore's records and wanted to expose his crimes. Problems. The hidden ledgers were unknown until Elijah revealed them. The level of detail in Elijah's knowledge exceeded what any records contained. The consistency of his testimony over 75 years makes sustained fraud implausible. The psychological cost to a child of maintaining such a deception would be enormous. Theory 2. Cryptomnesia or unconscious memory. This theory suggests Elijah somehow absorbed information about Jonathan Whitmore through overheard conversations or brief exposure to documents, then unconsciously organized it into a coherent narrative he believed were memories. Problems: the sheer volume of accurate information exceeds what could be absorbed unconsciously. Elijah knew things no one alive knew until he revealed them. The theory doesn't account for his knowledge of Jonathan's subjective experiences and thoughts. Theory 3. Genetic memory. This theory, proposed by some early 20th century researchers, suggested memories could be inherited genetically. If Jonathan Whitmore was Elijah's biological father, perhaps memories transferred through heredity. Problems: the timing makes this unlikely. Jonathan died before Elijah's conception. Modern genetics has found no mechanism for transferring complex episodic memories through DNA. The theory doesn't explain why Elijah would inherit Jonathan's memories but not Sarah's. Theory 4. Reincarnation. This theory takes Elijah's claim at face value. Jonathan Whitmore's consciousness survived death and was reborn in Elijah Carter's body. Problems: this contradicts the materialist understanding of consciousness as produced by brain activity. It requires accepting the existence of a soul or consciousness that can exist independent of a physical body. It raises theological questions about why this would happen and why it isn't more common. Theory 5. Unknown psychological phenomenon. This theory admits ignorance. Something happened with Elijah Carter that we don't have a framework to explain. Perhaps consciousness operates according to principles we don't yet understand. Perhaps in rare cases, information can transfer between people through mechanisms we haven't identified. Perhaps Elijah's case is a genuine anomaly that points toward gaps in our understanding of mind, memory, and identity. No theory fully accounts for all the evidence. The case remains unexplained. Dr. Ian Stevenson, a psychiatrist who spent decades researching claimed cases of reincarnation, investigated Elijah Carter's case in the 1960s. He reviewed the historical documentation and interviewed Elijah's surviving grandchildren. His conclusion: the Carter case is one of the most well-documented and evidentially strong cases of claimed past life memory I have encountered. The accuracy of the subject's knowledge, the presence of multiple credible witnesses, and the existence of contemporaneous documentation make fraud or fantasy highly unlikely explanations. Whether this constitutes proof of reincarnation is a question I cannot answer definitively, but it constitutes evidence that demands serious consideration. The moral question. But perhaps the most important question isn't whether Elijah Carter's memories were real. Perhaps the most important question is what his case reveals about justice, memory, and moral responsibility. If we accept that Elijah genuinely remembered being Jonathan Whitmore, what does that mean? It means a man who enslaved others was forced to experience enslavement. A man who sold children was reborn as a child in the same condition as those he'd sold. A man who kept meticulous records of his exploitation was reborn with those records burned into his consciousness, unable to forget or deny what he'd done. Is that justice? Is that punishment? Is that education? Or is it something else? A demonstration that the categories we use to divide humanity are artificial. That consciousness, if it exists beyond the body, doesn't recognize race or status or power. That the person who suffers and the person who inflicts suffering are not as separate as we pretend. Elijah Carter spent his life trying to answer these questions. He used his impossible knowledge to free the enslaved, to expose crimes, to educate the oppressed. He turned Jonathan Whitmore's memories into tools for liberation. He transformed a curse into a mission. "I don't know why I remember," he wrote near the end of his life. I don't know if there's a God who arranged this or if it's just a strange accident of a universe we don't understand. But I know this. The people Jonathan Whitmore hurt deserved to be remembered. Their names deserved to be known. Their suffering deserved to be acknowledged. And if the only way that could happen was for Jonathan's consciousness to be reborn in a body like theirs, forced to see them as human, forced to feel what they felt, then maybe that's not punishment. Maybe that's just the universe insisting on truth. Maybe that's what justice looks like when it crosses the barrier of death. The records that remain today, Elijah Carter's story, exists in archives scattered across the American South. Morrison's report is held by the North Carolina State Archives. Hughes's journals are in the Presbyterian Historical Society in Philadelphia. Elijah's manuscript is in the Library of Congress. The Plantation records, including the hidden ledgers Elijah revealed, are split between Duke University's special collections and the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. The 12 children Jonathan Whitmore sold have names now, recorded in Elijah's testimony: Samuel, Ruth, Isaac, Mary, Daniel, Joseph, Rebecca, Thomas, Sarah, Benjamin, Elizabeth, and James, ages 6 to 13 when they were sold. 4 recovered and freed, 3 confirmed dead, 5 never located. The 3 murdered men have graves now, marked with stones that give their names and the truth about how they died: Jacob, Thomas, and Daniel, killed by Jonathan Whitmore, remembered by Elijah Carter. The house where Elijah revealed the hidden ledgers still stands, though it's been converted into a museum. Visitors can see the cabinet with the false back, can read copies of the ledgers, can stand in the room where a 7-year-old boy pointed to a secret no living person should have known. And they can ask themselves the question that Elijah Carter's existence forces us to confront. What do we really know about consciousness, identity, and the possibility of justice that transcends the boundaries we think are absolute? Your turn to remember now. I need you to do something. Think about the stories you've been told about the past. Think about the histories that have been hidden, the records that have been destroyed, the names that have been forgotten. Think about the systems of exploitation and violence that people tried to bury, tried to deny, tried to erase from memory. Elijah Carter's case suggests that sometimes the universe doesn't allow erasure. Sometimes the truth finds a way to surface, even if it takes the form of an impossible child with memories that shouldn't exist. Comment below. Do you believe Elijah Carter's memories were real? Do you think consciousness can survive death? Do you think this was divine, justice, or something else? And tell me, what stories from your own community's history need to be remembered, need to be told, need to be preserved before they're lost? Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, because the work Elijah Carter did, the work of remembering, of testifying, of refusing to let crimes be forgotten, that work isn't finished. Every generation has to choose whether to remember or to forget. Every generation has to decide whether to face uncomfortable truths or to bury them. Elijah Carter chose to remember. He chose to testify. He chose to transform his curse into a tool for justice. What will you choose? Subscribe to this channel if you want more stories like this. Stories about resistance, about memory, about the people who refused to let history be erased. Stories about the impossible things that force us to question everything we think we know. Because Elijah Carter's story isn't just about one boy with impossible memories. It's about all of us. It's about the question of whether we're willing to see the humanity in people we've been taught to see as other. It's about whether we're willing to acknowledge the crimes of the past and work toward justice in the present. It's about whether we believe that truth matters, that memory matters, that the names and lives of the forgotten matter. Elijah Carter believed those things. He spent 75 years proving it. The question is, do you? Remember his name. Remember the names of the people Jonathan Whitmore hurt. Remember that sometimes the universe insists on truth, even when truth seems impossible. Remember, testify, refuse to forget. That's how we honor the past. That's how we build a better future. That's how we prove that the work of people like Elijah Carter, the work of turning memory into justice, wasn't in vain. Comment memory below. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what stories from your community need to be remembered. Let's build a community of people who refuse to let history be erased, because that's what Elijah Carter would have wanted. That's what the people he remembered would have wanted. That's what justice demands. Remember,